Um, Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second session of the fifth season of Sheltering Places, which is the new center's public program and ongoing student-run response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Um, Today's session is called Vibes and the Aesthetics of Atmospheres. It's with Peli Grietzer, Esther Leslie, and Tonino Griffero, which hasn't joined us yet, but they probably should in the next couple minutes. Um, I'll just read the curatorial text here and then the guests' bios, and then we can start with our conversation. Also, I'd like to remind everyone that the Center has open applications to its fall-winter 2021 season. I think the applications are ending on October 15, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, and then apply for that if you're interested in this sort of event and in this sort of thinkers, right? So in the last few years, the notion of vibe has become commonplace in cultural discourse. From TikTok trendsetters to theoretical mathematicians, there persists a sense that unspoken emotions linked to ambiances and intuitive abstractions of qualities are effective descriptors for a number of complex social interactions, stylistic configurations, and artistic forms. Articulated or not, such vibes or atmospheres are logically grounded on the idea that a bundle of affective elements can be flattened into a single category that encompasses manifold events as ineffable yet immediately accessible resonances, emanations of phases. Yet these conceptual halos or felt spaces, quote unquote, are not exactly auto-objective or apperceptive patterns, but are constantly interpolated by political, symbolic, archetypal, and constructive dialectic meaning. Um, this episode of Sheltering Places seeks to provide maps for the navigation of atmospheric topologies and to discuss the role of both metaphysical fabulation and scientific transcendence in the decodification of auratic experiences. Um, so Peli Grietzer has a PhD in comparative literature from Harvard University under the advisorship of Tomer Schlenk. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Grietzer's work borrows mathematical ideas from machine learning theory to think through the ontology of ambient phenomena like moods, vibes, styles, cultural logics, and structures of feeling. Peli is an on and off contributor to the experimental literature collective Gauss PDF and an occasional curator and dramaturg. He's currently working on the artist Zion Abraham Hazan's first feature film. I think I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly again. And we're working his research into a nonfiction book under the title, provisional title, correct? Big Mood, a transcendental computational essay on art. Esther Leslie is professor of political aesthetics at Birkbeck, University of London. Her interests lie in the poetics of science and imbrications of politics and technology. Her current work focuses on turbid media and the aesthetics of turbulence. Um, Her books include various studies and translations of Walter Benjamin, as well as Synthetic Worlds, Nature, Art, and the Chemical Industry, published in 2005. Liquid Crystals, The Science and Art of a Fluid Form, published in 2016, and Deeper in the Pyramid with Melanie Jackson, published in 2018. I'll also read Tonino's bio, even though he's not here yet, because I still hope he comes. Tonino is a full professor of aesthetics at University of Home Tor Vergata, editor of the book series Atmospheric Spaces, Sensibilia, and of the e-journal Leban's Wealth. He is the author of more than a dozen books, including Atmospheres, Aesthetics of Emotional Spaces, Quasi-Thing, The Paradigm of Atmospheres, and Places, Affordances, Atmospheres, Apathic Aesthetics. So first I would like to welcome you two who are here and maybe ask you to present yourself and say a little bit about your current research and interest and your initial relation to this overall team. Peli, maybe first.
Hi. By the way, the reason why in my bio I mentioned my advisor Tomer Schlank is because my gimmick is that Tomer Schlank is a professor of mathematics. My thing is I'm the person who does literary theory influenced by mathematics, but tries to do it with actual mathematician. Woo! Anyway, so I'm going to try and give a kind of speed run through the main idea of my dissertation, which is by inheritance also the main idea of the book project that I'm working on. The project that I've been working on, presents a mathematically informed cultural materialist interpretation of a classically romantic literary theoretic idea. The idea that the work of literature can aesthetically communicate an ineffably complex, holistic understanding of the real world, a kind of understanding which we might call perhaps the work's aesthetic meaning as such. Drawing on a generalization of deep learning, aka artificial intuition systems, and on elementary algorithmic information theory, my project describes a kind or aspect of aesthetic meaning, which I call ambient meaning, that may have a special resonance with modernist and avant-garde approaches to aesthetic meaning, and also may have special resonance with the concepts of the kind of aesthetically sophisticated cultural materialist literary theory that we sometimes call affect studies these days, and is embodied by such thinkers as such critics as Sayan Nye or Raymond Williams. Going into a little bit more detail, what my project defends is essentially what's maybe the most iconically outrageous excess of modernist, symbolist, and romantic thought about art. Roughly the doctrine that the work of the poet or whatever artist can embody the truths of a deeper stratum of reality as pure aesthetic form. So I read this idea, this sort of hysterically modernist, symbolist, romantic idea that a work of art is kind of pure aesthetic form that is at the same time, even though and perhaps because it is nothing but pure aesthetic form, also a reflection or an emanation of some kind of fundamental structure of reality or of the conditions of reality or of the conditions of experience or what have you. I read this doctrine is actually quite in good keeping with contemporary scientific understanding of the mind or of the possibilities for minds as revealed in current computational and cognitive science and recent developments in AI and machine learning. Specifically, I argue that this modernist romantic symbolist doctrine has quite a lot of affinities with a family of AI techniques called autoencoders, or more broadly, sometimes called latent variable generative models. I'll try to spend 3 minutes just going over the basic deals of what an autoencoder is before passing the baton ahead. So an autoencoder is a neural network tasked with learning to make facsimiles through a compression bottleneck. The point of an autoencoder, or the point of the learning process of an autoencoder, for the neural network to learn how to leverage rich recursive patterns that holistically structure the data in its training set. And through that, develop a kind of gestalt fluency that ambiently models its training set like a niche or life world. In other words, an autoencoder has to learn how to turn a huge data set into a compressed representation, such that it can then use the compressed representation, which contains much less raw information, just in terms of bytes, than the original data set. It starts with then using it to reconstruct the original data set. And it turns out that the task of learning to do this, the task of learning to compress a data set into code that can pass through a small bottleneck, requires a kind of quasi-conceptual understanding of the nature or the inner logic or the gestalt or the systemic grammar of the data set. So for example, if I'm training an autoencoder on a huge data set of faces, it will end up like developing a kind of like code for faces that if we like sort of like review it and try to describe it as like scientists, we'll be able to say something like, oh, look, like one of the elements of the code corresponds to something like jaw shape. Another element of the code corresponds to like hair color. Another element of the code corresponds like to skin tone. And those things just sort of like become spontaneously developed through the task of compression and reconstructing. Let's say the autoencoder learns a kind of code that acts as a coordinate system for the space of possible faces as a result of having to learn how to compress and reconstruct a huge data set of faces, starting with no structure whatsoever. So, Heidegger famously talks about Stimmung, or like mood, a presumed view of the total picture that conditions any specific attitude towards any particular thing. And my work argues that autoencoding I'm skipping some steps here, but like bear with me because we don't have a lot of time to get from one step to another. I argue that autoencoding, by in its learning process, extrapolating a space of possibilities from a collection of phenomena, constructs something very similar to like a Stimmung or a mood. It constructs a kind of totality of possibilities that gives individual phenomena meaning by relation to a totality. In this sense, we can see autoencoding as the sense and cognition of a kind of Stimmung of a system or a kind of Stimmung of a data set. What an autoencoding captures for its learning process, something like how the elements that compose a certain data set or a certain system vibe. It captures itself like way about it that the system or the data set has. And in my work, I argue that by thinking about the knowledge communicated in like a work of art as akin to the kind of knowledge captured by an autoencoder, we can unify a bunch of like different, important, and seemingly competing approaches to the question of what is the nature of like the knowledge, if there is any, communicated by a work of art or communicated by a modernist, symbolist, romantic type work of art. The first of these paradigms about the knowledge contained in a work of art is something like a modernist work of art aims to demonstrate a way of looking at the world that's associated with people like Shianai or Jonathan Flatley. The second such paradigm is that the modernist works aims to demonstrate a kind of field of weak affinities between many heterogeneous worldly or textual materials found in the world and collected by the work and patched together. This paradigm is associated with such like avant-garde poets as like Tan Lin or like high modernist formalist theorists like Hugh Kenner. And the final paradigm, I think, can be unified through the idea of an autoencoder, is that the modernist work aims to demonstrate systemic forces and structures, underlying phenomena that appear to the naked eye, unstructured. And that, in a way, is sort of like the original high symbolist, theory of artistic meaning. So we find it mostly in sort of like the Ars Poetica of Charles Baudelaire or later Gertrude Stein. And yeah, the argument of my work, which I won't be able to actually go over here, is that through like the figure of the autoencoder that gives us an actual like technical mathematical model of a kind of like ambient knowledge, we can explicate and like unify these like different paradigms about what is like the knowledge contained in sort of like this sort of like abstract high, kind of avant-garde or like modernist or even romantic art, and also maybe wrote its relationship, to like both social and like transcendental structures in the world. Thanks so much, and sorry for how rushed this was. Time is a harsh mistress to us all.
No, I think that was actually great, and thank you. I think that actually gives us a lot to discuss about in a couple minutes. And now I'll pass the mic to Esther. Esther.
Thank you. I think I'm going to produce an atmosphere or a mood or a vibe. So I wrote out what I wanted to say about this. I think my interest in the atmospheric is it's something to do with the materialization of metaphors and the becoming metaphor of materials in the world. So atmosphere is something we breathe, it's air, and it's all that air contains. And so my interest in atmosphere is to do with this medium through which we move, which also happens in some sense to be part of the media that we consume in various ways. So just to explain that a little, Romulo mentioned this work I'm doing that I call turbid media, which is both a reference to a sort of term in science in terms of media, or something like water that becomes very muddy and stirred up, and that's a turbid media. But I'm also punning on the idea that we live in a world which is subjected to constant media inputs and circulation. And I think of this as a kind of turbulence in the world. And very quickly, I start to play with the sort of metaphor around this of fog. And fog is a busy agitation of particles, if we see that as a weather event, or we can see it as a pollution event, smog, smoke, and fog. But now we can also think of this turbid particularity in air, in the gas that we breathe, as possibly even something invisible that saturates our environments and enters our bodies. But this turbulence or fog is also an intangible atmosphere, feelings around and about. For a while, I've been interested in much longer stories of phases of matter which involve liquid and crystals as forms that have participated historically in conveying, literally and figuratively, information. Most notably in our epoch, they come together as liquid crystals, the basis of our devices, our digitality, as well as of ourselves physically. But to take a shortcut into the present, my thinking in this direction has thought about the ways in which the liquid crystal has become fogged over. We enter, from the solid to the fluid to the gaseous epoch, and information no longer flows liquidly in our imagination, at least, or glimmers held in the crystal as we might have once thought. Information is now in the fog, in the cloud, obscurely held, and this is also our atmosphere through which we move and in which we feel. And that feeling sort of feeds into the fog. This is me thinking about the logging of our emotions on Likert scales and reaction buttons and so on. So my work of late has been looking more closely at fogs and froths and foams as substances that are both industrial, meteorological, participate in pollution, in city life, in cafe store, cappuccinos or lattes or whatever, or this sort of relationship to these turbid and soft and interstitial matters, which is sort of distributed widely throughout our world and beyond, in fact, while at the same time, there's all this sort of metaphorical or figurative overflow of all of that. So fogging computing and the internet of things, and so on. So there's a sort of transfer between the natural, the produced, and the technological in some way. I'm interested in the root word of turbidity, which derives from turba, which in Latin means uproar, disturbance, or crowd. And so I think about these forms of matter as both cloud-like and crowd-like in their form. So fogs and froths and foams as turbulent crowd clouds of atoms, entities, particles, and particulates in particular. moments. So I'm trying to get across this sense in which there's this sort of flow backwards and forwards, and this is how atmospheres work. They seep, and they seep outside of themselves in some way. And for me, they seep across the categories. So they exist in forms, in new forms, as well as old forms in the world, but they're also ideological phantasms of our political and social condition. And I suppose I thought about, ways in which we might have thought our predominant metaphorical base might have been around, questions of flow and liquid carriage and this sort of, liquid modernity and so on. But we seem to exist in an age where that has hit various types of barriers. So one could take as an emblem of that the 220,000 ton, 400 meter long Ever Given mega ship blocking the Suez Canal in March 2021, or there are other ways in which there's this sort of interruption of this flow. I mean, I could also talk about sort of Brexit and the much trumpeted by the Conservatives ending of the freedom of movement, as they were celebrating the other day, and the ways in which that becomes a kind of obfuscated event, because no one really knows what that marks. So it's part of this kind of fog of interruption that's obscure even to those who push the policy through. I should probably condense all of this in some way. One of the things I was thinking about was the ways in which in our immediate past, this sort of turbulence and foggedness and atmosphericness has played roles in and outside of the pandemic and the movement of turbulent clouds of droplets as lethal factors, and the management of that, and how that sort of participated in these other conceptual things of distancing and separation, and all sorts of ways in which crowds and fogs have been politicized and mobilized recently. But yeah, okay, I think I'll stop it there, and maybe some of the other things I would say would kind of come back through the discussions. So thank you.
Yeah, no, that was very, very good. Thank you, Chi. And I like when you mixed up the Suez Canal with a sewage canal. Yeah, so my first question would be, so the approaches and theoretical frameworks of both of you are clearly very different, and we can see that from the presentation. Leslie comes from like media theory and like cultural studies more generally, and Peli comes from a very specific relation between math and literature. And also, if I would add Tonino, I'd say he comes like from architecture and a more classical oriented aesthetic discipline. But there's one, I think, common root between you two and you three, which is the concept of Stimmung, which Peli already mentioned, even and this Heideggerian influence. Stimmung can be translated as mood or ambience, but it also means the tuning of an instrument, right? So the question is, could you all clarify a little bit the relation between the morphology of atmospheres and Heideggerianism, or the concept of Stimmung more specifically? Like, is phenomenology a necessary theoretical toll to pay for those who want to discuss the idea of aesthetic atmosphere, and why? So who wants to go first with that? I don't know.
I mean, it's very interesting to bring this up as of like, is phenomenology like a necessary toll here? Because sort of like, famously and sort of like, the sort of like, the article where like Carnap, sort of like famously tries to like assassinate like Heidegger, like the dissolution of metaphysics through like the logical analysis of like language. Carnap recruits like the Dilthian concept that Heidegger sort of like adapts into the concept of like Stimmung, to sort of like say, look, metaphysics and stuff like, and also the kind of like phenomenological metaphysics like Heidegger does is just sort of like a very bad way to try to like create or express what like Dilthey calls, a fundamental attitude to life. There's like, a German sounding word for it in German that I don't quite remember. It's like 11 something. So the current like makes the case that, in fact, if we sort of like take it, we can sort of like use the idea that there are sort of like fundamental kinds of attunement to the world around us, sort of like enacting themselves both as like structures of perception, attention, and as structures of speech and action. That this idea is sort of like sufficient to like inherit like the whole domain of metaphysics and of like non-scientific philosophy, and sort of like fold it into or like unify it with the domain of like art, where like Karen claims that sort of like ultimately metaphysics will never be as good at conveying an attitude to life as music or poetry is, and therefore poetry and music should really sort of like take over like the job that used to be sort of like shared between the arts and metaphysics and mythology and like religion. This would sort of like all be funneled into the work of the artist, and then maybe the work of a certain kind of natural phenomenologist who deals with like the philosophical and technical elaboration of the mechanisms that allow us to like grasp and create and understand and communicate in between these fundamental modes of attunement. I guess what I'm trying to say is just that, like, interestingly, one can think of, the sort of like emerging indispensability, perhaps, of like some kind of like Stimmungi discourse, either as sort of like, that's the thing through which like phenomenology or sort of like 20th century continental philosophy writ large can hook and drag all other like discourses into itself. Or alternatively, as Carnap thought, this is perhaps like, sort of like the one sort of like like element of truth in continental philosophy, but it is one which can actually in fact be like subsumed into the workings of like art and of a sort of like naturalized cognitivist philosophy of art. So I think something like the indispensability of like a mood discourse goes both ways and puts sort of like every it's sort of like, I don't know, both puts like a lot of sort of like empirical like discourse at like the danger of sort of like, oh look, you actually need Heideggerianism, but it also sort of like puts like Heideggerianism at risk of sort of like, actually all that we need is like kind of like empiricist discourse plus just this like additional thing of like moods, but like all the truth that there is to be found in like Heideggerianism is to be found in this like one idea which can just be a pendant of fundamentally empiricist psychology. So I think
that's interesting. I don't think Leslie will agree with that. Will you, Leslie? I don't know.
No, I have to distance myself as far as I can possibly get from Heidegger, and not just sort of politically unacceptable to me, but also, I think not philosophically interesting to me. Although, I know that, in a sense, there's a kind of dogging between Benjamin and Heidegger, but Benjamin is also very explicit about his rejections. But I suppose, if I think of my recent work, I was quite interested in in Gaston Bachelard's 1930s work on intuition and matter, and his writing about dust and interstitial matters, which are so rarely conceptualized, within this sort of philosophical terms. And I've just found it very striking how, for example, he talks about dust and the experience of seeing dust in the world. Descartes seeing dust in his environment, in the world, dancing, twinkling in the sunlight, or whirled up by the wheels of a carriage. And that translates for matter into conceptualization of atomism, and that the world is made of atoms. So that kind of tuning between matter and thought, I suppose I'm sort of doing some sort of version of that when I think about liquid or crystals or gases in some way. But and I'm also really interested again in the 20s and 30s work of Alfred Döblin, really strange stuff he was writing after he wrote the more famous Berlin Alexanderplatz. He was writing these massive books where he was researching the sort of aberrant scientists who emerged out of a kind of romantic model, I suppose. I think people like Hans Kaiser, who talked about sort of how the whole world is rhythmic, and it's about the mathematical basis which expresses itself as a rhythmic basis in nature, and that's all about vibing and resonances, and from the smallest to the biggest. And to me, that's also sort of reflected in these extraordinary attunements by people nowadays who reject Big Bang theory and think about plasma theory, and how the sort of the action of electricity at the tiniest scale is what is also at work at the most massive scale in the universe. But then I'm also thinking a lot these days. Another book I'm writing is about Walter Benjamin's best friend, Ernst Schoen, which I'm writing with Sam Dolbear. And Schoen ran Frankfurt Radio for a few years before being imprisoned by the Nazis. And he was a student of Varese and Busoni, and he wrote in a dissonant mode. And so I've become also very interested in dissonance rather than tuning. So, and dissonance isn't untuning, but it's something that cuts across tuning, and to me speaks to a certain modernist moment. Yesterday I came across a fantastic quote from Duke Ellington from 1941, where he's being interviewed before a gig in Los Angeles, and he plays the interviewer some of his music from that period, and then says, "That's dissonance. That is," as he puts it, "that is the Negro in America today, an integral part of and apart from this society." And so, and for me, there's, Adorno's reading of Schoenberg and Schoen's reading of Schoenberg, about it's something that I don't just want this attunement, I want the dissonance, I want the outer tune, and as a critical relationship to the Stimmung. So it's also an Unstimmung or a A-Stimmung or something else.
That's very interesting. I actually also like Bachelard very much, in the sense that and I think maybe you too might like him. I don't know if Peli reads Bachelard a lot, but because he has this very scientific books, right, and a very scientific vision of the world, which is also very informed by poetry and mythology, and he has this scientific books which are insane, and I tried reading them, and they are like very advanced in terms of like algebra and physics, right, discussing the new scientific reasoning, and then there's books on like the elements and the symbolic formation of fire and water, right? So, and maybe he's like a good point of departure from this sort of more scientific sort of way of looking at vibes, and this more of phenomenological and intuitive way of looking at it. But my next question actually was like recently I've read some critiques of the notion of vibe as anti-intellectual or anti-hermeneutic assumptions, like they provide this conceptual and even slightly metaphysical leap. And so they provide a dismissal of any need for explaining or interpreting the world further than their own installation, right? I think a good philosopher to give an example that does that is Hans-Ulrich Gombrich, which I don't know if you, and I don't think you two cite him in any way, which is kind of interesting to me. And also, I don't think you two or you three, if we include Tonino, cite each other, which is something I mentioned before we started the live, which is also very funny because given that you are all studying this kind of same thing, right? But Gombrich, he posits this notion of ambience or aesthetic atmosphere, which is completely divorced from textual interpretation. And he actually bases the thing on the human body and this idea of immersion and suspension. So the question is like if atmospheres are intuitive and ineffable, aren't they self-confirming and self-explanatory? And this sort of cuts the debate short, right? Doesn't this kind of obfuscate the possibility of expanding on what a vibe could be, on what an atmosphere could be? How would you respond to that? I don't know if I made myself clear, but maybe Peli first. I don't know, or I don't know if Esther wants to say.
So I guess, I would like, first of all, I guess, to distinguish between, explicating what a vibe is in the sense of explicating the concept vibe and how vibes as such relate to other I don't know, ontological and epistemic and cognitive and computational categories versus, so that's one sense in which you can ask, are vibes explicable? Another sense is is for a when it comes to a particular vibe, can we do more than point at it and name it? Sure, we can can point at it, name it, and talk about what kind of thing a vibe is and how it's sort of and what kind of mathematical framework could be used to sort of understand in principle what underlies this type of structure and our ability to recognize it. But then perhaps what you're saying is that the question remains: is there more to say about the particular vibe that we're currently engaged with itself beyond just sort of pointing and appreciating? And I think that's a good question because I guess I would say that at some level, I do think that in at least one form of the intellectual indispensability of art is that art is our interface, is our sort of representational and discursive interface with vibes. It allows us to represent vibes in a crystallized form, as opposed to the sort of looser forms in which they exist out in the wild. Actually part of my formal model of autoencoders, it tries to offer a sort of concrete account of how things in the world are or have been at some point, some people would say pretty Kafkaesque, but then the fictional world of the castle or of or the texture of Kafka's short stories, taken together as a textual corpus, or the experience of reading Kafka. You might locate these objects in various ways, but anyway, I would say each one of these objects, they're more than Kafkaesque in the way that the world are Kafkaesque. They're properly Kafkan. You might think of stuff the properly Kafkan as a crystallized form of the Kafkaesque like vibe that's out there like in the world, or that like was there in the world when the world was like peak Kafkaesque in like the early 20th century, and that the creation of these like crystallized forms of like vibes that allow us to cognize the vibe like out like in the world, not just in the ambient way in which we experience them by participating in them and being like attuned to their habitus, but rather to like experience them in a sort of like reflective, representational, sort of like concentrated way that then maybe allows for like sophisticated acts of comparing and contrasting, and can maybe then perhaps like incorporate them into like more like dialectical or narratival processes of thought about, well, this is how the world is seen in a certain regard, seen in a certain way with respect to certain patterns and structures. How can we see different patterns and structures in the same world? Can we see the same pattern and structure in different like possible contexts? Can we think of this like field can we think of these patterns and structures as like revealing a field of possibilities of different ways that the world could be while maintaining this vibe? Can we think of it as giving us the conditions for like ways we can change the world such that the world would break this vibe? I think all of these sort of like acts of complex model thinking are things that become like available through the cognitive interface of verbal, visual, musical, and so forth, like objects that present a vibe in a crystallized form, and that this is very much part of like the work of art as such, or at least the work of art as such when we conceive of art in the sort of like high modernist, symbolist, romantic register.
How about you, Leslie? Do you think atmospheres are anti-intellectual or anti-hermeneutic?
No, I mean, I'm just trying to think of my connections to that. I remember being very fascinated by the sort of Gabrielle Tard's kind of notion of contagion, and just thinking about how these things, how an emotion or a feeling or a sentiment or an idea as well, possibly something more intellectualized, sort of passes through, contaminates an environment, moves through very quickly and sweeps people up into it. So moods as kind of catching and to that extent a sort of expression of the irrational, but at the same time possessing their own logic, and not all moods sweep through. Maybe there are world historic vibes or something that catch on, and so many that fall away, and I think we have to think about that element of time as well, how things become exhausted or become thrown out or unfashionable. The vibe check happens and the thing stops, or the vibe moves on in some way. But I'm really interested in what Peli is saying about this sort of, if you could crystallize what it means to be Kafkaesque or Stein-esque or whatever. I mean, is this is then the basis for being able to say, if you could condense that and characterize it, then potentially you could make an AI that produces something that produces that vibe, because you've been able to distill it in some way.
Kafka is the condensation of the Kafkaesque, and like Stein is the condensation of the Steinian. I don't think that there's sort of like further crystallization to be made. I rather think of like those artists' work as like a crystallization of something that was more widely present in a more, let us say, foggy form. So I think, we already have the Gertrude-Stein formula. The Gertrude-Stein formula is Gertrude Stein. We already have the Kafka formula. The Kafka formula is Kafka.
Then I suppose I want to throw in, Beckett, and who in a sense could become one of these. Beckett produces a mood, a vibe that is Beckettian, but at the same time he'll say F the ineffable, fuck the ineffable. This is, precisely, he wants to detourn or explode what could become a kind of preciousness around the artwork that's sort of defining its own grounds and working somehow within a realm of atmospheres that's detached from a material positioning or questions of production or all those other elements that are much more tangible, I suppose. But that's part of just his also general playful.
Yeah, I think that's another possible critique of the idea of atmospheres, actually, is that they are a little bit anti-political, no? Or they create opacities in the way of an analysis of the materiality of media? Or wouldn't you agree with that? Like, for example, understanding the correlation between one media structure and its erotic effects, or noticing that behind any erotic effect, there is always a net of material circumstances. Also seeing politics through the lenses of vibes could lead to the aestheticization of governance that like for Benjamin, for example, was the essence of fascism, right? Like a Nazi vibe could be aesthetically appealing but politically not appealing. How do you two respond to the claim that ambiances are politically problematic? Isn't it weird to think of metaphorical atmospheres in a time of the dissolution and pollution of the actual atmosphere of the planet too? Maybe that's a question.
Yeah,
how do you think these two atmospheres relate, right? That the metaphorical and the actual atmosphere.
I think that precise question was one of the things that made me want to think about the atmospheric, as you put it, at that moment when atmospheres are polluted and politically polluted. In the UK, it was a very significant moment a few years ago when a new immigration policy was pursued, which was politics aimed at producing a hostile environment. So effectively a hostile atmosphere. You work on the politics of atmosphere to make foreign people feel unwelcome, so they will leave. The most monstrous, horrible populism. And so that sense of a political manipulation of atmospheres, well, there's also an environmental degradation of atmospheres, meant that I was thinking about it, not in terms of, not in a sort of apolitical sense of, just these environments and what we feel and how we sense, but as something that is subject to manipulation. And for me, it comes, yes, precisely through Benjamin's interest in aura, where everything has to be historically positioned. The aura of the artwork is something that makes sense in a particular age of religious art and then art for exhibition, but becomes retrograde at that moment when it's, from his point of view, just becomes an add-on or something faked or something politically manipulated by the Nazis in order to justify their political aesthetics. So yeah, I do think what one has to conceptualize atmospheres in relation to politics and history.
So, famously, in like, I want to say the 70s, like Raymond Williams, did sort of like the synthesis to many people's satisfaction, which is like, coining of the concept of like structures of feeling, which was sort of like Stimmung for Marxists. And of course, from like another direction, also like in the 70s, Bourdieu, like in the discourse of like habitus, which is like another kind of like, Heidegger for like, again, I guess not Marx, but Heidegger for critical materialists. I'm giving Heidegger way more credit than I would ordinarily like to, but let's say like Dilthey for like critical materialists, Dilthey for like Marxists, because Heidegger really took so much from like Dilthey with this stuff. I think
I was actually very surprised to reread Bourdieu and find that he's a very phenomenological kind of guy, right? He's a phenomenologist with some Marx toppled on top of it. Yeah, but go ahead. I was just
so that like I guess like I see vibe as at least like within like a certain domain to which like a vibe seems to sort of like adequately apply, within some context, maybe within like context of some like self like affirming false consciousness, but still false consciousness is also true, Adorno, blah blah blah, whatever. Sorry, what I'm trying to say is like I do see like a vibe as like kind of like classical Kantian like understanding as like the attunement that enables sensus communis. I think it allows like common cognitive like attunement between multiple like agents in a common life world, and which is the condition of all empirical judgment and of all applications of like concept, and in fact for like the practice of like science like itself within the domain structured by the vibe. That at least is like my reading of like like the third critique. Kant says in like the first intro to the third critique that the third critique really is about the question of the possibility of like empirical judgments and what of like grounds our like confidence that the categories we apply in empirical judgments that go beyond the pure concept of like space-time to like a priori guaranteed to hold in as much experience as possible, in as much as experience as possible. There is sort of like a further sort of like layer of like assumption built in to empirical concepts that just sort of like assumes that, well, the world has a certain like way about it that we are kind of just like as human agents like attuned to in a way that allows us to like form concepts that will be functionally stable and allows to communicate with one another and sort of like operate in the world with some sort of like safety buffer that things wouldn't just constantly behave in ways that break all our concepts as we build them. So I think of like vibe as being vibe as being like this kind of like precondition for all the like work of like analysis and theorization that can then come at least in as much as we're concerned with like a certain like life world constructed like by like a vibe. Maybe you could like at some level analyze the pure material conditions of that life world in ways that are just like completely detached from the sort of like internal categories active in this life world, and that wouldn't require any kind of like attunement to the vibe at all, and more like a concept of the vibe. But it'd be sort of like saying that like Martians could sort of like do Marxist cultural theory without needing to sort of like understand like human culture like at all, just by having like pure that having access to the immortal science of Marxism, Leninism, or something. Anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say, like, in as much as we think like cultural theory has to take place within the lived world of culture, or has to at least be to some extent sensitive to its dynamics and the realities. These dynamics and realities are sort of like their very coherence is like constituted by a kind of stability that we call like a vibe, and any further theorization sort of like comes on top of grasping, understanding the vibe.
That's interesting. I think perhaps the side question, which is permeating all of those answers, is like how objectives really are vibes. like ambiences. Like I realize they are mostly subjective, of course, but there's also a degree of like inferential and consensual realism, in the sense that you and I, we agree that there is this kind of vibe, so there is probably this kind of vibe, right? And ambiences also touch upon like historically consolidated symbols and myths, correct? So in such a way that like might make them universal in some cases. Is the author, like, is Kafka the objectivation of a vibe, for example? Already, is he objective vibe of the Kafkaesque? Or and I know you two might diverge a lot in this case. Like Peli explains vibes in a mathematical and analytic philosophical terms by comparing them to autoencoders, right? So maybe he sees them as almost objective. And
Yeah,
I know you're
almost objective is exactly right.
okay. So I know you're currently working on a. Sorry, go ahead.
I think they're like, I think that like, yeah, there's something close, like an objective fact that such and such a domain has such and such like a vibe. Once we sort of like, I'm like settle some parameters such as like, what do we count as changes in the state of a domain? What do we count as objects in the domain? What do we count as like the experienced qualities of the domain and so forth? I mean, there's like a huge layer of like human subjectivity, but I think sort of like at some point, once you sort of like, filled in like all the details in accordance with like certain facts of like human subjectivity, there's then going to be something fairly close to like information theoretic facts underlying
I think maybe
judgments.
I think maybe Esther has the complete opposite perspective, in which maybe she. I think one of the tenets of the atmospheric emotion is that they are kind of vague, and not the objects of the emotion are not necessarily outlined perfectly, right, Esther? Or am I wrong about that?
Yeah, so, although I keep thinking of this example that Benjamin brings up, and he's talking about the popular physicist Arthur Eddington in the 20s, and Eddington describing, what happens when somebody crosses a threshold, and it's all about this world is spinning and everything's vibrating, and there's space between all the molecules. It's a wonder that we step through. And Benjamin says, this science is as Kafkaesque as any story by Kafka. And then that raises the question, and this is what interests me, the kind of coincidental and analog, that in two different places, sort of similar, uncertain, conceptualizations are made, and one in the domain of science and one in the domain of literature. And I think I in a sense, I just want to continue that. And I think we become, because we're so exposed through our media and through our constant connection, we all now, we don't read the equivalent of Arthur Eddington. We see pictures of the world at the nano level with its little blurry animations, and we see animated CGI models of inside a human cell, and we're exposed to those visions, and we absorb them, and we poeticize them, and we take them into our vocabulary. So for me, that's where sort of resonances and vibes and threads kind of reach out, and then come into language. So we all are in the kind of vibe of entanglement now, or whatever these sort of latest sort of conceptualizations of relationality are, because these things seep and move around. But so there's something, it happens, I suppose, at many levels, and partly that's objective, and it's about new knowledge that's communicated to us, and it's just about what politically kind of works for us to think through in any point, which may have a large subjective element to it.
I think that's a good segue to the next question, I believe, which is basically, and which maybe is Esther's own opinion, and maybe she can complement that with her own words. I don't want to paraphrase you or anything like that, but isn't atmospheres, Peli, just one of the possible metaphors for the topological forms of affect, right? Isn't there? What about the liquid, the colloidal, right? What about these other states, which also might signify a sort of relation between a relation of affect, right? And I'm thinking maybe of like the mathematical topology and how there could be like a sort of spatial structure for vibes, in the sense of maybe Zalamea's use of Riemann and Grothendieck and maybe Gilles Châtelet, they handle these notions of one and many to develop a vision of art as a complex holomorphic structure in which there are many layers and or which is a structure which is multi-valued and are consistent with itself. And maybe we can see other forms for a vibe, no, which is not only atmospheric, but I don't know. There are other environmental forms of affect, no. And I think here again of Bachelard, maybe there would be poetic phenomenology of vibes in the sense of how they appear to us, or I think also of Gilbert Durand's schema for the structures of imagination and how we could maybe create this new structures, topological structures for affect, right? Isn't there like a glossary of affective topologies waiting to be written based on these wider symbolic anthropologies? And vibes would be like atmospheric vibes would be just one example of a more major category. Why should the topology of atmospheres be favored in this case, or how do you think atmospheres diverge from other metaphors for affect specifically? Maybe Peli first, or I don't know who wants to go first.
So one thing that immediately came to mind is that I think, if we're looking for sort of like, okay, I think like the concept that's maybe closest to sort of like vibe in sort of like pre-20th century philosophical traditions is, from the relatively little I know of it, the like Vedic aesthetic philosophy concept of like rasa, which from what I understand means something, quite close to like flavor in its like non-philosophical usage. So that's that's already like I feel like one interesting like alternative like modality in which to think of like the ambient or the vibe. It's not like, oh, it's just like the flavor that things have. So instead, like, of course, like, in the early 20th century, obviously like the language like dominates kind of this was like the language of like attunement, which again, like, the relevant like, modality is, is like the musical one. So I think, I don't know, I guess what I'm trying to say is like my instinct is to be fairly ecumenical here and think that we have a lot of like good sort of like metaphorical like modalities for talking about this sort of like diffused multi-scale structural unities, which is, I guess, how I would describe it, maybe like more like technical vocabulary, the thing that like, we call like vibes or like moods or like atmospheres. And I mean, I definitely think that there's enrichment of the discourse to be found in either creating or discovering or like, uncovering from multiple sources further like metaphorical like, modalities for this work of conceptualization. I maybe have like, enough of an analytic philosophy bias to have a slightly skeptical disposition towards how much our thinking is going to be sort of like dominated by our like pet metaphor at the moment for what may ultimately be a phenomenological / technical / logical mathematical concepts. Although I certainly read it, a plurality of metaphorical frameworks and vocabularies can be inspiring and enriching.
That's actually very clear. Esther, maybe you can. I don't know if you agree with what I said actually, but I know your research is more oriented towards that more multifarious analysis of atmospheric
Yeah,
meaning.
I suppose I like to think across all of matter, a gas, liquid, solid, but then also particularly these interstitial forms where liquid crystals and froths and foams and combinations of these elements of these phases lie, and the ways in which those combinatory things, gas plus air, liquid plus crystal and so on, how those seem to be so prevalent and operative in certain ways in our world. But I think also because I'm thinking about radio as well a lot at the moment as a historical entity, I wonder if what I'm interested in is the movement or the circulation, and in a sense it's not necessarily the stuff, but kind of the stuff in vibration passing on waves, sound waves, light waves, water waves. So it's about the passage of these things. It's about their distribution or the act of being distributed rather than perhaps the things themselves, or it's as much about that movement, I suppose, because that's how it comes in and through the world and in and through us and makes us feel certain ways or does certain things to us and to other things.
That's great. And finally, probable last question because we are 1 hour and 10 past our time. Okay. So it is actually a question that is not written down because I was thinking during your talks, which is how to relate this sort of atmospheres with the concept of word making, in the sense of Nelson Goodman, but also of Susan Langer, for example, that the atmosphere of an artwork might be the actual turbid correlation between objects in a given set that exist in the virtual counterpart to that artwork, right? So like vibes are also created, they are also produced, and they are created both by the artist and by the spectators in this process of discovering and also sedimenting things onto the virtual world of art, right? So when we listen to a song, we at the same time we discover its vibe and we also put our memories into it and transform that vibe. So it's like perforating an oil well. We carry things with us and then we take them back like inside out and outside in, right? So how should we posit kind of a way of building vibes? There is grounded, I don't know, in a logical framework. I don't know. How can we give maps for creating vibes, certain types of atmospheres, and how can we give guidelines to relating ourselves with some specific atmospheres? Maybe there are some toxic atmospheres, for example. Should we deal with them? Yeah. So, what's your thoughts on that?
I'd love to read a paragraph from my book in progress where
of course.
I describe because I feel like people often Alexander Gottlieb Baumgarten, known nowadays basically just for being the person who coined the term aesthetics. I feel like one of the most widely underrated once famous philosophers. Because people are unaware of how much he created almost from nothing the discourse of poetry as a mode of ineffable knowing or of ineffable thought, and I think Yeah, he has like a very cool, kind of quirky account of how like poems create a kind of knowing that while ineffable is nevertheless rationally complete. So I'm gonna read like 300 words about it very quickly. So Baumgarten's treatise of poetry was, in many ways, the first time anyone in Europe talked about poetry as ineffable. Until Baumgarten, the essential mark of poetry was that it's made up, and maybe secondarily, now touching on ineffability in a banal sense, that it's emotive or concrete. For Baumgarten, however, studying poetry demonstrated that anything we can think explicitly, not just concrete objects, but also patterns, comparisons, abstractions, expectations, generalizations, values, relations, we can also think ineffably. Concluding that this calls for a new field of study, Baumgarten coined the term aesthetics as a name for the philosophy of sensate, i.e. majestic, sensory, intuitive, ineffable, cognition. While the possible applications of the new subfield were wide-ranging, in reality, Baumgarten mostly built a theory of the value and workings of good poetry. Still, for all that aesthetics quickly came to mean the study of beauty or taste after Baumgarten, it's useful to remember that for Baumgarten, good poetry was nothing but good thinking of a special kind, making aesthetics a subfield of logic. Baumgarten's theory of good poetry had a kind of absurd computer science brilliance to it. Good poetry is simply a large quantity of sensate thought. The trick to this absurd sounding idea is that to think a lot, but all at once, we have to think associatively, self-referentially, vividly, temporally, spatially, emotionally, analogically, particularly, generally, recursively, anything and everything that keeps our thoughts interconnected in a living whole. And these interconnections themselves, as we grasp them, not only maintain the manifold of thoughts, but enter into it themselves as ineffable thoughts of relations, and then as ineffable thoughts of relations of ineffable thoughts of relations, and so on, until we reach the fullness of what Baumgarten called beautiful thinking. Even our experience of the poem's beauty, finally, is itself ineffable thought of the overall interconnection of the manifold of ineffable thought, completing the beautiful thought with thought of its own beauty. For Baumgarten, thought coming to the thought of its own beauty was a kind of sensate QED, our faculty of sensate reason, recognizing the completeness of a thought.
All right. That was very intense. Esther, if you want to answer the question and also respond to Peli.
Yeah, so I was thinking of, romantic critique and that idea. I mean, also here in the Baumgarten, in a way of that the completion of the work through the critical apprehension of it. And for me, this sets in train this incredible dance between subject and object, which I was also thinking as you were speaking, Romulo, about, it changes us, an atmosphere or a poem or something changes us and we change it through our remembering, and there's this sort of circuit backwards and forwards. And then I was thinking of this very strange comment Benjamin makes in One Way Street, where he's talking about the latest scientists, latest brain science tells us that when we think, thought doesn't happen inside our head, it happens at the thing that we are thinking about. So, and he's sort of trying to use science to sort of underpin some, extraordinary dialectic between inside and outside. And I suppose that's where I want to keep thinking about these things. And again, it's that movement thing, that relay backwards and forwards. But I also think, when you say, what do we do with the toxic atmosphere? I do think there's also a realm of just political struggle and political refusal, and we go and we change it, we make it change in a more direct way, rather than this sort of wonderful kind of cycling of it entering us changing it and moving backwards and forwards. I think there is also, the demand that can be made that this atmosphere kills or harms, and therefore it must be changed in some other way.
Awesome. That's beautiful. Do you guys have any other final thought or final addition to this program, which has been spectacular, at least on my end, I believe?
I'm just really sorry Tonino was not here, because I was looking at his thing in Inventi, which I also did something about bubbles in Inventi, and he wrote about wind in Inventi, and it's a really beautiful piece. Everyone should at least go and read that.
Yeah, his work is very good, and he's influenced by Gernot Bohm and all these guys who thought of the aesthetics of atmospheres. That is pretty good. So nice having you, Esther. Thank you again, and everyone, I really recommend Esther's seminar at the New Center if you want to become a member and watch it. It's pretty good. Peli, any final words?
Yeah, I guess just that in my current research project, I'm becoming increasingly convinced that something like vibe is the central concept of German rationalism, from sort of Leibniz to Wolff to Kant. Don't know about Hegel and onwards, maybe then it changes, but it's sort of the key sort of concept of rationality in German rationalism was this concept of harmony, which is really quite close to what we would now call a vibe. The idea that the world is held together by a graspable vibe is what puts the rationalism in German rationalism. That's something I'm thinking a little bit about nowadays.
Very interesting, because actually most people think of vibes as a sort of mystic, quasi-religious thing, right?
Well, German rationalism is a bit mystic. I mean, they both invented the computer, sort of. Leibniz was Leibniz wanted to be a poet. Being a philosopher was his second choice.
Yeah, all of them, right? All of them are undercover theologians, if you check it out. But okay, so thank you to Peli. It was very nice having you. I love your work, and yeah, I hope I can get a glimpse of your work again. Both Esther and Peli. I hope to read your next book, Peli, and Esther. Anything that you write, I'll be giving a go at that. Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful.
Thanks for your questions and everything. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.